Welcome to True Crime Threads. A family torn apart by betrayal and deceit. Elena and Luca had been married for 5 years, their relationship built on a foundation of love, trust, and shared dreams. From the moment they had met, they both knew they were meant to build a future together. They had planned their lives carefully, their hearts filled with hope for the family they would eventually create. The early years of their marriage were blissful traveling, enjoying each other's company, and savoring the quiet moments before they both began to think about having children. As their friends and family started having children, the idea of becoming parents began to take root in their minds. Elena, particularly, dreamed of motherhood. She imagined a home filled with the laughter of children, the smell of freshly baked cookies, and the chaotic joy of family life. It was a dream she had carried with her for as long as she could remember, and now that she was married to Luca, she felt it was the perfect time to begin this next chapter of their lives. They started trying for a baby soon after their second anniversary, their hearts full of excitement and anticipation. Each month brought hope, but when Elena didn't fall pregnant right away, she brushed it off as normal. It wasn't unusual for couples to take time to conceive, she told herself. But as months turned into a year, and then into a year and a half, the excitement faded, replaced by an undercurrent of anxiety. Something wasn't right, and Elena couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her chest that they might not be able to have a child on their own. Luca, ever the optimist, tried to reassure her. He told her that everything would work out, that there was no rush. But Elena's heart ached every time she saw a friend post photos of their newborns, or when she heard people talk about their growing families. She began to feel the sting of envy, the silent pressure that every woman feels when her body doesn't cooperate with her deepest desires. The longing to become a mother became a silent obsession, haunting her thoughts day and night. She couldn't help but feel incomplete, as though something was missing from her life. After a year and a half of trying without success, Elena and Luca decided to see a doctor. At first, Elena thought it was just a formality. They would do some basic tests, and surely they would find that everything was fine. But when the results came in, they were devastating. The doctor explained that Luca was infertile, a condition that could not be treated. The diagnosis hit them both like a thunderclap. For Luca, the news was crushing. He had always taken pride in being healthy, in being the strong provider for his family, and now this news felt like a personal failure. Elena, too, was shattered. She had dreamed of having children with Luca, of seeing his eyes reflected in their own child. Now that dream seemed impossibly out of reach. The emotional weight of the diagnosis was overwhelming, and the couple found themselves struggling to cope. The silence between them grew heavier, filled with unspoken words and unshed tears. Luca, in his pain, tried to hide his feelings, but Elena could see the disappointment in his eyes, the guilt that he carried even though none of this was his fault. The couple tried to remain hopeful, but the reality of their situation began to settle in. They discussed options: IVF, sperm donors, adoption, but each suggestion felt like a reminder of the dream they had so long hoped for, slipping further and further away. Their attempts at seeking solutions were met with frustration and the crushing knowledge that their plans might never come to fruition. The constant pressure, the endless appointments, and the failed treatments began to strain their relationship. What had once been an exciting journey was now a painful and costly path that left them feeling defeated. Elena tried to stay strong for Luca, but inside she felt herself unraveling. The dream of becoming a mother that she had carried for so long now seemed impossible. She could see the sadness in Luca's eyes whenever he spoke about their future, and she couldn't help but wonder if he would ever be able to forgive himself. And worse still, she began to wonder if they would ever find a way to have the family they both so desperately wanted. Elena's mind raced with possibilities, each one leading to the same painful truth. Despite the love she shared with Luca, despite the efforts they both had made, they were still unable to conceive. The idea of living without a child, without the family she had always dreamed of, seemed unbearable to her. As weeks passed, The disappointment began to take on a physical weight, settling on her shoulders like a constant burden. Every day, Elena fought against the sinking feeling that her dream would never be realized. She immersed herself in research, scouring websites and forums for any possible solution, any shred of hope that could make her wish come true. She considered every possibility: IVF, surrogacy, even adoption, but none of them seemed like the answer she so desperately needed. The costs were staggering, and the emotional toll was too much to bear. Elena's frustration began to cloud her judgment. Every night, as she lay awake next to Luca, the desire for a child gnawed at her, eating away at her resolve. She loved him deeply, but the dream of motherhood had taken on a life of its own, one that she couldn't easily ignore. One evening, after dinner, as the two sat quietly in their living room, Joseph appeared unexpectedly. He had always been a supportive presence in their lives, always there when they needed him, offering guidance and wisdom. But tonight there was something different about him. Elena couldn't put her finger on it, but there was an underlying tension in the air, an unspoken sense of urgency that she had never felt before. Joseph sat across from her, his expression calm but his eyes intense. He started by asking how they were both holding up, how the fertility treatments had been going, and whether they had found any solutions. Elena and Luca exchanged glances, both of them tired from the emotional roller coaster they had been on for months. Elena could see the weariness in Luca's eyes, and she knew he was trying to keep up the facade of optimism for her sake. But the truth was, they were both exhausted physically, emotionally, and financially drained by the constant cycle of disappointment. Joseph listened intently, nodding as they explained their situation. Then, after a long pause, he made a suggestion that left Elena speechless. He told her that although Luca could not have children, there was still a chance for her to become pregnant through him. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as Elena struggled to process what she had just heard. Joseph's voice remained steady, as though he were offering her a simple solution to a difficult problem. He explained that his own fertility was still strong, that he could help her achieve the family she so desperately wanted. At first, Elena thought she had misheard him. She searched his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke, but there was none. Joseph was serious. His offer was not just an idea, it was a proposal. She could feel the room closing in on her, the walls pressing against her chest as she tried to grasp what was happening. It seemed impossible, unthinkable. How could he suggest such a thing? But as the seconds ticked by, Elena's mind began to race. She thought of the years of trying and failing, the deep longing she had felt for a child, and the frustration that had become all-consuming. The desperation to become a mother was now so overpowering that it clouded her judgment. She couldn't imagine her life without a child. The hope of motherhood, of holding a child in her arms, suddenly seemed so close, and Joseph's offer, though wrong, felt like the only way to get there. She struggled with her emotions, torn between disbelief and a gnawing sense of relief. Could she really go through with it? Could she betray her husband in such a profound way, for the chance to bring a child into the world? It was wrong, she knew that. But the weight of her desire, her longing for a family, seemed to push those thoughts to the back of her mind. In that moment, the possibility of becoming a mother outweighed everything else. Joseph, seemingly unaware of the emotional turmoil Elena was going through, continued to explain his reasoning, trying to make it sound like a simple solution to a difficult problem. He spoke of his love for his son and daughter-in-law, of how much he wanted to see them happy, and how he was willing to help in whatever way he could. Elena listened, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the storm of emotions that had overtaken her. After what felt like an eternity, Elena finally nodded. She didn't know what she was agreeing to, but in her heart, she knew it was the only way forward. She would go through with it, because the alternative, the life without a child, was simply too much to bear. And so, with a heavy heart, Elena made the decision that would change everything. The decision Elena had made weighed heavily on her as the days passed. She tried to push the gnawing sense of guilt to the back of her mind, but it lingered like a shadow. There was no going back now. The moment she had agreed to Joseph's offer, everything had shifted. What had seemed like a desperate solution in the heat of the moment was now a reality that she had to live with. Every time she looked at Luca, the love of her life, she felt the guilt eating away at her. He was completely unaware of what was happening, unaware that his father had crossed a line so profound that it threatened to tear their entire world apart. Elena couldn't bring herself to tell him. The shame of it all was too great. She was too deep in the lie to back out now, and besides, she told herself, this was for a good cause, this was for the child she would finally carry in her arms. At night, when she lay next to Luca, she could feel his warmth beside her, his steady breathing a stark contrast to the storm of emotions inside her. They would talk about their hopes for the future, about the baby they would soon have, and Elena would smile and nod, trying desperately to keep up the appearance of a hopeful wife. But inside, her heart was heavy, and her thoughts would drift to the secret she was hiding. There was no way to reconcile the image of the man she loved with the truth she was now living. Joseph was careful. He was calculating, and Elena soon realized that his visits had become more frequent. He would find excuses to stop by, and each time the unease inside her grew. Their interactions were always brief, always under the guise of simple visits, but she could feel the tension between them, the unspoken understanding of what was going on. The physical encounters had begun slowly, and each time, Elena's emotions were torn. She wanted to believe that this was just a means to an end, a necessary step to fulfill the dream she had for so long, but with each moment, the lines between what was morally right and wrong blurred even further. There were times when Joseph would speak to her softly, trying to comfort her, assuring her that what they were doing wasn't as terrible as it seemed. He painted the act as something necessary, even noble, an act of sacrifice for the greater good of their family. But Elena knew better. She could feel the weight of what was happening, the magnitude of her betrayal, but the yearning for a child kept her moving forward, kept her from turning back. She had tried to convince herself that this was the only option left. The doctors had said it was Luca's condition that had caused the infertility, but there was no way to fix it. IVF would take time, and the costs were mounting, far beyond what they could afford. Adoption, though a possibility, was a lengthy and complicated process that would never feel like their own. In her mind, Joseph's solution, though morally reprehensible, was the quickest way to make her dreams of motherhood come true. Days turned into weeks, and as the pregnancy tests began to show positive results, Elena's heart swelled with a mixture of joy and terror. The lines on the test were faint at first, then darker, clearer, until there was no denying it. She was pregnant. But with every passing day, the reality of the situation began to sink in deeper. Elena was carrying a child, but it wasn't Luca's. No matter how much she wanted to convince herself otherwise, the truth was undeniable. The baby growing inside her was a product of betrayal, a result of choices she had made under pressure and fear. She would smile when Luca placed his hand on her belly, his face beaming with excitement and hope. But inside, Elena's heart was breaking. She could already hear the lies she would have to tell once the child was born, the explanations she would have to offer, the questions that would inevitably come. She couldn't think about that now. All she could focus on was the baby that she had longed for, the one she had been willing to go to such lengths to have. Every day she felt the weight of her decision, and with each passing moment it became harder to hold on to the hope that this would all turn out okay. The secret she carried inside her was growing, and soon the truth would have to come out. But for now, Elena kept moving forward, unable to stop, unable to look back. As Elena's pregnancy progressed, the weight of her secret grew heavier with each passing day. Every day she carried the child inside her, the more the guilt festered, but the joy she felt at the prospect of becoming a mother was undeniable. She had longed for this moment for so many years, and despite everything, the thought of finally holding a child in her arms overshadowed the moral consequences of how she had gotten here. But there were moments when the guilt was overwhelming, moments when she would look at Luca and see the hope in his eyes, and she would feel like a fraud. Luca was ecstatic. He could barely contain his excitement as the days went by, constantly talking about their future together as a family. He would talk about baby names, what kind of life they wanted for their child, the vacations they'd take as a family once the baby was born. His enthusiasm was contagious, and there were times when Elena felt like she could almost forget the lie she was living. In those moments, she allowed herself to dream with him, imagining a life where everything would be perfect, a happy family, a beautiful child, and the kind of future they had always talked about. But those moments were fleeting. The moment Luca would leave for work or when they would go to sleep, the reality would hit again. The baby growing inside her was not Luca's, and no amount of pretending could change that. Each time she felt the baby kick, each time Luca placed his hand on her belly, the shame would return. She told herself that once the baby was born, everything would be easier. Luca would fall in love with the child, and they would raise it together as a family. But deep down, she knew the truth was far more complicated than that. Then came the day that changed everything. It had started like any other day. Luca had left for work early, and Elena found herself alone in their home. The silence felt deafening as she went about her day, cleaning, organizing, trying to distract herself from the storm brewing inside her. But when she checked her phone, her heart skipped a beat. There was a message from Luca only. It wasn't a message from him at all. It was a text from Joseph. Her stomach dropped as she opened the message, not knowing what to expect. It wasn't just any message, it was a photo. The picture was blurry, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. "I know," it read. Elena's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had just seen. It was the first crack in the illusion, the first sign that everything was about to unravel. She thought back to the past weeks. Joseph had been distant, his visits more frequent, his demeanor colder. But she had never imagined that he would confront her like this, not in such a blatant way. The phone call came not long after. It was Luca. He was on his way home earlier than expected, and he wanted to talk. The fear that gripped Elena in that moment was suffocating. She knew that the truth was coming out, and she had no idea how to stop it. The lie she had been living, the betrayal she had been trying to bury deep within herself, was about to explode in the worst possible way. When Luca walked through the door, he didn't say a word. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as he held out his phone. There, on the screen, was the picture. She froze. There was no escaping it now. Luca didn't need to ask her anything. He could see the truth written on her face, in the way her body stiffened as she looked at the picture. He could see the guilt, the shame, the fear that radiated from her. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing over him and pulling him under. He didn't need to hear the details. He already knew. The silence between them was suffocating. Elena wanted to speak, to explain, to tell him everything, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain the unexplainable? How could she make him understand that everything she had done had been driven by an insatiable desire to become a mother? She had never meant for any of this to happen. She had never meant to betray him, to hurt him in such a profound way. But in the face of the truth, all of that seemed irrelevant. All that mattered now was the damage she had done and the irreparable rift she had created. Luca stood there, staring at her, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and disbelief. His face was a mask of shock, as though he had just learned that everything he believed in was a lie. The pain in his eyes cut through Elena, and in that moment she understood the full extent of what she had done. She had broken him, shattered the trust they had built together. But the worst part was yet to come. There would be no easy answers, no way to undo the damage. The truth had come out and there was no going back. The days following the confrontation felt like a blur to Elena. Each passing moment seemed to stretch on forever, as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. Luca had left that day without a word, without even a glance at her, and had stayed at his father's house for the next few days. He didn't answer her calls, and when she left messages, they went unanswered. The silence between them was deafening, and Elena could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest with every passing minute. It wasn't just the pregnancy that weighed on her, it was the destruction of everything she had ever known, everything she had worked so hard to build with Luca. Elena found herself pacing their home in the quiet hours, staring at the empty space beside her in bed, the coldness that seemed to settle into every corner of their life. The once warm and loving house now felt like a hollow shell. She couldn't escape the constant barrage of guilt that threatened to overwhelm her. She had made a choice, and it had torn apart the one thing she had always treasured, her relationship with Luca. But there was also the growing life inside her, the child she had fought so hard to conceive. The baby was hers, the one bright spot in the storm that had become her life. But even the thought of the baby brought mixed emotions. Her mind kept flashing back to the text message from Joseph, the photo that had exposed everything. She had been so careful to keep things hidden, to protect the lie she had created. But nothing remained hidden forever. She knew now that the secret would never stay buried. Luca knew. Joseph knew. Everyone would know eventually. And the shame of it all would follow her, an indelible stain on everything she had ever hoped for. Days turned into weeks. Luca remained distant, his heart closed off to her. He refused to speak to her in person, instead communicating only through brief, emotionless texts. He had stopped coming home altogether. Elena spent her days in a fog of confusion and despair. She tried to reach out to him, to apologize, to explain herself, but each time she did, it felt like she was pushing him further away. The words she needed to say seemed impossible to form, because she knew that no matter what she said, it would never be enough. The damage was done. During this time, Joseph continued to visit, though his presence felt more like an intrusion than a comfort. He would stop by the house, his face calm, as though nothing had changed. He would ask how Elena was feeling, whether the pregnancy was progressing well, and if there was anything he could do to help. Elena could barely stand to look at him. He had destroyed her life, shattered the trust she had with Luca, and yet he acted as if he had done nothing wrong. His calm demeanor, his quiet assurances that everything would work out in the end, only made her feel more isolated, more desperate. She wanted to scream at him, to demand that he take responsibility for what had happened, but she said nothing. The truth was, she couldn't blame him alone. It was her choice, her decision that had led them here. Joseph was simply the catalyst. One day, Luca returned. Elena didn't know what to expect, but she knew it was time for a reckoning. He walked into the house, his eyes cold, but there was something else there too: hurt, confusion, and betrayal. It was the look of a man whose world had been turned upside down, whose life had been shattered by the woman he loved. They stood facing each other for a long time, neither knowing what to say. Luca was the first to speak, his voice low and filled with raw emotion. He asked her why she had done it. Elena opened her mouth to explain, to justify her actions, but the words felt empty, hollow. How could she explain something that didn't even make sense to her anymore? How could she justify betraying him in such a way? The only truth she could offer was that she had been desperate, so desperate to have a child that she had allowed her emotions, her needs, to blind her to everything else. But she couldn't say those words. The shame of it was too much. The conversation turned into an argument, then into silence once more. Neither one of them could find the words to heal the wound that had been inflicted. They both knew that things could never go back to the way they were. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was gone. Elena realized, in that moment, that there was no way to undo the damage. She had shattered their world, and there was no putting it back together. Weeks turned into months, and the tension between them remained. Luca was distant, though he did his best to remain civil for the sake of the child that was growing inside Elena. But the love they had once shared, the bond they had built together, was gone. What had once been a beautiful, loving marriage had been reduced to a fragile shell, held together by nothing more than the impending birth of a child. Elena tried to focus on the pregnancy, to tell herself that everything would be okay once the baby arrived. She thought that the birth would bring a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, but deep down, she knew it would never be that simple. The truth was, nothing could undo what had been done. The child she carried, though a blessing, would forever be a reminder of the lies, the betrayal, and the brokenness of her relationship with Luca.